The Everlasting Man by K Chesterton, Part 2, on the Man Called Christ, Section 6, The 5 Deaths of the Faith. It is not the purpose of this book to trace the subsequent history of Christianity, especially the later history of Christianity, which involves controversies of which I hope to write more fully elsewhere. It is devoted only to the suggestion that Christianity, appearing amid heathen humanity, had all the character of a unique thing and even of a supernatural thing. It was not like any of the other things, and the more we study it, the less it looks like any of them. But there is a certain rather peculiar character which marked it henceforward, even down to the present moment, with a note on which this book may well conclude. I have said that Asia and the ancient world had an air of being too old to die. Christendom has had the very opposite fate. Christendom has had a series of revolutions, and in each one of them Christianity has died. Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. For it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. But the first extraordinary fact which marks this history is this: that Europe has been turned upside down over and over again, and that at the end of each of these revolutions the same religion has again been found on top. The faith is always converting the age, not as an old religion but as a new religion. This truth is hidden from many by a convention that is too little noticed. Curiously enough, it is a convention of the sort which those who ignore it claim especially to detect and denounce. They are always telling us that priests and ceremonies are not religion, and that religious organization can be a hollow sham. But they hardly realize how true it is. It is so true that 3 or 4 times at least in the history of Christendom, the whole soul seemed to have gone out of Christianity, and almost every man in his heart expected its end. This fact is only masked in medieval and other times by that very official religion which such critics pride themselves on seeing through. Christianity remained the official religion of a Renaissance prince, or the official religion of an 18th century bishop, just as an ancient mythology remained the official religion of Julius Caesar, or the Aryan Creed long remained the official religion of Julian the Apostate. But there was a difference between the cases of Julius and of Julian, because the church had begun its strange career. There was no reason why men like Julius should not worship gods like Jupiter forever in public and laugh at them forever in private. But when Julian treated Christianity as dead, he found it had come to life again. He also found incidentally that there was not the faintest sign of Jupiter ever coming to life again. This case of Julian and the episode of Arianism is but the first of a series of examples that can only be roughly indicated here. Arianism, as has been said, had every human appearance of being the natural way in which that particular superstition of Constantine might be expected to peter out. All the ordinary stages had been passed through. The creed had become a respectable thing, had become a ritual thing, had then been modified into a rational thing, and the rationalists were ready to dissipate the last remains of it just as they do today. When Christianity rose again suddenly and through them, it was almost as expected as Christ rising from the dead. But there are many other examples of the same thing even about the same time. The rush of missionaries from Ireland, for instance, has all the air of an unexpected onslaught of young men on an old world, and even on a church that showed signs of growing old. Some of them were martyred on the coast of Cornwall, and the chief authority on Cornish antiquities told me that he did not believe for a moment that they were martyred by heathens, but, as he expressed it with some humor, by rather slack Christians. Now, if we were to dip below the surface of history, as it is not in the scope of this argument to do, I suspect that we should find several occasions when Christendom was thus, to all appearance, hollowed out from within by doubt and indifference, so that only the old Christian shell stood as the pagan shell had stood so long. But the difference is that in every such case, the sons were fanatical for the faith, where the fathers had been slack about it. This is obvious in the case of the transition from the Renaissance to the Counter-Reformation. It is obvious in the case of a transition from the 18th century to the many Catholic revivals of our own time. But I suspect many other examples which would be worthy of separate studies. The faith is not a survival. It is not as if the Druids had managed somehow to survive somewhere for 2000 years. That is what might have happened in Asia or ancient Europe, in that indifference or tolerance in which mythologies and philosophies could live forever side by side. It has not survived. It has returned again and again in this Western world of rapid change and institutions perpetually perishing. Europe, in the tradition of Rome, was always trying revolution and reconstruction, rebuilding a universal republic. And it always began by rejecting this old stone and ended by making it the head of the corner, by bringing it back from the rubbish heap to make it the crown of the capital. Some stones of Stonehenge are standing and some are fallen. and as the stone falleth, so shall it lie. There has not been a Druidic renaissance every century or two, with the young Druids crowned with fresh mistletoe dancing in the sun on Salisbury Plain. Stonehenge has not been rebuilt in every style of architecture, from the rude round Norman to the last Rococo of the Baroque. The sacred place of the Druids is same from the vandalism of Restoration. But the church in the West was not in a world where things were too old to die, but in one in which they were always young enough to get killed. The consequence was that superficially and externally it often did get killed, nay, it sometimes wore out even without getting killed. And there follows a fact I find it somewhat difficult to describe, yet which I believe to be very real and rather important. As a ghost is the shadow of a man, and in that sense the shadow of life, so at intervals there passed across this endless life a sort of shadow of death. It came at the moment when it would have perished had it been perishable. It withered away everything that was perishable. If such animal parallels were worthy of the occasion, we might say that the snake shuddered and shed a skin and went on, or even that the cat went into convulsions as it lost only one of its 999 lives. It is truer to say, in a more dignified image, that a clock struck and nothing happened, or that a bell tolled for an execution that was everlastingly postponed. What was the meaning of all that dim but vast unrest of the 12th century when, as it has been so finely said, Julian stirred in his sleep? Why did there appear so strangely early in the twilight of dawn after the Dark Ages so deep a skepticism as that involved in urging nominalism against realism? For realism against nominalism was really realism against rationalism, or something more destructive than what we call rationalism. The answer is that just as some might have thought the church simply a part of the Roman Empire, so others later might have thought the church only a part of the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages ended as the empire had ended, and the church should have departed with them if she had been also one of the shades of night. It was another of those spectral deaths or simulations of death. I mean that if nationalism had succeeded, it would have been as if Arianism had succeeded. It would have been the beginning of a confession that Christianity had failed. For nominalism is a far more fundamental skepticism than mere atheism. Such was the question that was openly asked as the Dark Ages broadened into that daylight that we call the modern world. But what was the answer? The answer was Aquinas in the chair of Aristotle, taking all knowledge for his province, and tens of thousands of lads down to the lowest ranks of peasant and serf, living in rags and on crusts about the great colleges to listen to the scholastic philosophy. What was the meaning of all that whisper of fear that ran round the West under the shadow of Islam and fills every old romance with incongruous images of Saracen knights swaggering in Norway or the Hebrides? Why were men in the extreme West, such as King John, if I remember rightly, accused of being secretly Muslims, as men are accused of being secretly atheists? Why was there that fierce alarm against some of the authorities about the rationalistic Arab version of Aristotle? Authorities are seldom alarmed like that. Authorities are seldom alarmed like that except when it is too late. The answer is that hundreds of people probably believed in their hearts that Islam would conquer Christendom, that Averroes was more rational than Anselm, that the Saracen culture was really, as it was superficially, a superior culture. Here again we should probably find a whole generation, the older generation, served doubtful and depressed and weary. The coming of Islam would only have been the coming of Unitarianism. The coming of Islam would only have been the coming of Unitarianism. The coming of Islam would only have been the coming of Unitarianism 1,000 years before its time. To many it may have seemed quite reasonable and quite probable and quite likely to happen. If so, they would have been surprised at what did happen. What did happen was a roar like thunder from thousands and thousands of young men throwing all their youth into one exultant countercharge the Crusades. It was the sons of Saint Francis, the jugglers of God, wandering, singing over all the roads of the world. It was the Gothic going up like a flight of arrows. It was the waking of the world. In considering the war of the Albigensians, we come to the breach in the heart of Europe and the landslide of a new philosophy that nearly ended Christendom forever. In that case, the new philosophy was also a very new philosophy. It was pessimism. It was nonetheless like modern ideas because it was as old as Asia most modern ideas are. It was the gnostics returning. But why did the gnostics return? Because it was the end of an epoch, like the end of the empire, and should have been the end of the church. It was Schopenhauer hovering over the future. It was Schopenhauer hovering over the future. But it was also Manichaeis rising from the dead, that men might have death and that they might have it more abundantly. It is rather more obvious in the case of the Renaissance simply because the period is so much nearer to us and people know so much more about it. But there is more even in that example than most people know. Apart from the particular controversies which I wish to reserve for a separate study, the period was far more chaotic that those controversies commonly imply. When Protestants call Latimer a martyr to Protestantism and Catholics reply that Champion was a martyr to Catholicism, it is often forgotten that many who perished in such persecutions could only be described as martyrs to atheism or anarchism or even diabolism. That world was almost as wild as our own. The men wandering about in it included the sort of man who says there is no God, the sort of man who says he is himself God, the sort of man who says something that nobody can make head or tail of. If we could have the conversation of the age following the Renaissance, we should probably be shocked by its shameless negations. The remarks attributed to Marlowe are probably pretty typical of the talk in many intellectual taverns. The transition from pre-Reformation to post-Reformation Europe was through a void of very yawning questions. Yet again, in the long run, the answer was the same. It was one of those moments when, as Christ walked on the water, so was Christianity walking in the air. But all these cases are remote in date and could only be proved in detail. We can see the fact much more clearly in the case when the paganism of the Renaissance ended Christianity and Christianity accountably began all over again. But we can see it most clearly of all in the case which is close to us and full of manifest and minute evidence. The case of the great decline of religion that began about the time of Voltaire. For indeed, it is our own case, and we ourselves have seen the decline of that decline. The 200 years since Voltaire do not flash past us at a glance like the 4th and 5th centuries or the 12th and 13th centuries. In our own case, we can see this oft-repeated process close at hand. We know how completely a society can lose its fundamental religion without abolishing its official religion. We know how men can all become agnostics long before they abolish bishops. And we know that also in this last ending, which really did look to us like the final ending, the incredible thing has happened again. The faith has a better following among the young men than among the old. When Ibsen spoke of the new generation knocking at the door, he certainly never expected that it would be the church door. At least 5 times, therefore, with the Arian and the Albigensian, with the humanist skeptic after Voltaire and after Darwin, the faith has, to all appearance, gone to the dogs. In each of these 5 cases, it was the dog that died. How complete was the collapse and how strange the reversal we can only see in detail in the case nearest to our own time. 1,000 things have been said about the Orthodox movement and the parallel French Catholic revival, but few have made us feel the simplest fact about it, that it was a surprise. It was a puzzle as well as a surprise, because it seemed to most people like a river turning backwards from the sea and trying to climb back into the mountains. To have read the literature of the 18th and 19th centuries is to know that nearly everybody had come to take it for granted that religion was a thing that would continually broaden like a river till it reached an infinite sea. Some of them expected it to go down in a cataract of catastrophe. Most of them expected it to widen into an estuary of equality and moderation. But all of them thought its returning on itself a prodigy as incredible as witchcraft. In other words, most moderate people thought that faith, like freedom, would be slowly broadened down, and some advanced people thought that it would be very rapidly broadened down, not to say flattened out. All that world of Guizot and Macaulay and the commercial and scientific liberality was perhaps more certain than any man before or since about the direction in which the world is going. People were so certain about the direction that they only differed about the pace. Many anticipated with alarm and a few with sympathy a Jacobian revolt that should guillotine the Archbishop of Canterbury, or a Chartist right that should hang the parsons on the lampposts. But it seemed like a convulsion in nature that the Archbishop, instead of losing his head, should be looking for his meter, and that instead of diminishing the respect due to parsons, we should strengthen it to the respect due to priests. It revolutionized their very version of revolution and turned their very topsy-turvydom topsy-turvy. In short, the whole world being divided about whether the stream was going slower or faster, became conscious of something vague but vast that was going against the stream. Both in fact and figure, there is something deeply disturbing about this, and that for an essential reason. A dead thing can go with the stream, but only a living thing can go against it. A dead dog can be lifted on the leaping water with all the swiftness of a leaping hound, but only a live dog can swim backwards. A paper boat can ride the rising deluge with all the airy arrogance of a fairy ship. But if the fairy ship sails upstream, it is really rowed by the fairies. And among the things that merely went with the tide of apparent progress and enlargement, there was many a demagogue or sophist whose wild gestures were, in truth, as lifeless as the movement of a dead dog's limbs wavering in the eddying water, and many a philosophy uncommonly like a paper boat, of the sort that it is not difficult to knock into a cocked hat. But even the truly living and even life-giving things that went with that stream did not thereby prove that they were living or life-giving. It was this other force that was unquestionably and unaccountably alive, the mysterious and unmeasured energy that was thrusting back the river, that was felt to be like the movement of some great monster, and it was none the less clearly a living monster because most people thought it a prehistoric monster. It was nonetheless an unnatural and incongruous and to some a comic upheaval, as if the great sea serpent had suddenly risen out of the round pond unless we consider the sea serpent had suddenly risen out of the round pond, unless we consider the sea serpent as more likely to live in the serpentine. This flippant element in the fantasy must not be missed, for it was one of the clearest testimonies to the unexpected nature of the reversal. That age did really feel that a preposterous quality in prehistoric animals belonged also to historic rituals, that meters and peras were like the horns or crests of antediluvian creatures, and that appealing to a primitive church was like dressing up as a primitive man. The world is still puzzled by that moment, but most of all because it still moves. I have said something elsewhere of the rather random sort of reproaches that are still directed against it and its much greater consequences. It is enough to say here that the more such critics reproach it, the less they explain it. In a sense, it is my concern here, if not to explain it, at least to suggest the direction of the explanation. But above all, it is my concern to point out one particular thing about it, and that is that it had all happened before, and even many times before. To sum up, insofar as it is true that recent centuries have seen an attenuation of Christian doctrine, recent centuries have only seen what the most remote centuries have seen, and even the modern example has only ended as the medieval and pre-medieval examples ended. It is already clear and grows clearer every day that it is not going to end in the disappearance of the diminished creed, but rather in the return of those parts of it that had really disappeared. It is going to end as the Arian compromise ended, as the attempts of a compromise with nominalism and even with Albigensianism ended. But the point to seize in the modern case, as in all the other cases, is that what returns is not in that sense a simplified theology, not according to that view a purified theology. It is simply theology. It is that enthusiasm for theological studies. It is that enthusiasm for the theological studies that marked the most doctrinal ages. It is the divine science. An old Don with D after his name may have become the typical figure of a bore, but that was because he was himself bored with his theology, not because he was excited about it. It was precisely because he was admittedly more interested in the Latin of Plautus than in the Latin of Augustine, in the Greek of Xenophon than in the Greek of Chrysostom. It was precisely because he was more interested in a dead tradition than in a decidedly living tradition. In short, it was precisely because he was himself a type of the time in which Christian faith was weak. It was not because men would not hail, if they could, the wonderful and almost wild vision of a doctor of divinity. There are people who say they wish Christianity to remain as a spirit. They mean very literally that they wish it to remain as a ghost. But it is not going to remain as a ghost. What follows this process of apparent death is not the lingerings of the shade, it is the resurrection of the body. These people are quite prepared to shed pious and reverential tears over the sepulchre of the Son of Man. What they are not prepared for is the Son of God walking once more upon the hills of mourning. These people, and indeed most people, were indeed by this time quite accustomed to the idea that the old Christian candlelight would fade into the light of common day. To many of them it did quite honestly appear like that pale yellow flame of a candle when it is left burning in daylight. It was all the more unexpected and therefore all the more unmistakable that the seven branched candlestick suddenly towered, towered to heaven like a miraculous tree and flamed until the sun turned pale. But other ages have seen the day conquer the candlelight and then the candlelight conquer the day. Again and again, before our time, men have grown content with a diluted doctrine, and again there has followed on that dilution, coming as out of the darkness is a crimson cataract, the strength of the red original wine. And we only say once more today, as has been said many times by our fathers, long years and centuries ago, our fathers or the founders of our people drank as they dreamed of the blood of God. Long years and centuries have passed since the strength of the giant vintage has been anything but a legend of the age of giants. Centuries ago already is the dark time of the second fermentation, when the wine of Catholicism turned into the vinegar of Calvinism. Long since that bitter drink has been itself diluted, rinsed out, and washed away by the waters of oblivion and the wave of the world. Never did we think to taste again even that bitter tang of sincerity and the spirit, still less the richer and the sweeter strength of the purple vineyards in our dreams of the age of gold. Day by day and year by year, we have lowered our hopes and lessened our convictions. We have grown more and more. We have grown more and more used to seeing those vats and vineyards overwhelmed in the water floods, and the last savor and suggestion of that special element fading like a stain of purple upon a sea of grey. We have grown used to dilution, to dissolution, to a watering down that went on forever. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. This is the final fact, and it is the most extraordinary of all. The faith has not only often died, but it has often died of old age. It has not only been often killed, but it has often died a natural death, in the sense of coming to a natural and necessary end. It is obvious that it has survived the most savage and the most universal persecutions, from the shock of the Diocletian fury to the shock of the French Revolution, but it has a more strange and even a more weird tenacity. It has survived not only war but peace. It has not only died often but degenerated often and decayed often. It has survived its own weakness and even its own surrender. We need not repeat what is so obvious about the beauty of the end of Christ in its wedding of youth and death. But this is almost as if Christ had lived to the last possible span, has been a white-haired sage of 100 and died of natural decay, and then had risen again, rejuvenated with trumpets and the rending of the sky. It was said truly enough that human Christianity in its recurrent. It was said truly enough that human Christianity in its recurrent weakness was sometimes too much wedded to the powers of the world. But if it was wedded, it has very often been widowed. It is a strangely immortal sort of widow. An enemy may have said at one moment that it was but an aspect of the power of the Kaisers, and it sounds as strange today as to call it an aspect of the pharaohs. An enemy might say that it was the official faith of feudalism, and it sounds as convincing now as to say that it was bound to perish with an ancient Roman villa. All these things did indeed run their course to its normal end, and there seemed no course for the religion but to end with them. It ended and it began again. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. The civilization of antiquity was the whole world, and men no more dreamed of its ending than of the ending of daylight. They could not imagine another order unless it were in another world. The civilization of the world has passed away, and those worlds have not passed away. In the long night of the dark ages, feudalism was so familiar a thing that no man could imagine himself without a lord, and religion was so woven into that network that no man could have believed they could be torn asunder. Feudalism itself was torn to rags and rotted away in the popular life of the true Middle Ages, and the first and freshest power in that new freedom was the old religion. Feudalism had passed away, and the words did not pass away. The whole medieval order, in many ways so complete and almost cosmic a home for man, wore out gradually in its turn, and here at least it was thought that the words would die. They went forth across the radiant abyss of the Renaissance, and in 50 years were using all its light and learning for new religious foundations, new apologetics, new saints. It was supposed to have been withered up at last in the dry light of the age of reason. It was supposed to have disappeared ultimately in the earthquake of the age of revolution. Science explained it away, and it was still there. History disinterred it in the past, and it appeared suddenly in the future. Today it stands once more in our path, and even as we watch it, it grows. If our social relations and records retain their continuity, if men really learn to apply reason to the accumulating facts of so crushing a story, it would seem that sooner or later even its enemies will learn from their incessant and interminable disappointments not to look for anything so simple as its depth. They may continue to war with it, but it will be as they war with nature, as they war with the landscape, as they war with the skies. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. They will watch for it to stumble. They will watch for it to err. They will no longer watch for it to end. Insensibly, even unconsciously, they will, in their own silent anticipations, fulfill the relative terms of that astounding prophecy. They will forget to watch for the mere extinction of what has so often been vainly extinguished, and will learn instinctively to look first for the coming of the comet or the freezing of the star. Conclusion. The summary of this book. I have taken the liberty once or twice of borrowing the excellent phrase about an outline of history. Though this study of a special truth and a special error can of course claim no sort of comparison with the rich and many-sided encyclopedia of history for which that name was chosen. And yet there is a certain reason in the reference, and a sense in which the one thing touches and even cuts across the other. For the story of the world as told by Mr. Wells could here only be criticized as an outline, and strangely enough it seems to me that it is only wrong as an outline. It is admirable as an accumulation of history. It is splendid as a storehouse or treasure of history. It is a fascinating disquisition on history. It is most attractive as an amplification of history, but it is quite false as an outline of history. The one thing that seems to me quite wrong about it is the outline, the sort of outline that can really be a single line, like that which makes all the difference between a caricature of the profile of Mr. Winston Churchill and of Sir Alfred Mond. In simple and homely language, I mean the things that stick out, the things that make the simplicity of a silhouette. I think the proportions are wrong. The proportions of what is certain as compared with what is uncertain, of what played a great part as compared with what played a smaller part, of what is ordinary and what is extraordinary, of what really lies level with an average and what stands out as an exception. I do not say it as a small criticism of a great writer, and I have no reason to do so, for in my own much smaller task, I feel I have failed in very much the same way. I am very doubtful whether I have conveyed to the reader the main point I meant about the proportions of history and why I have dealt so much more on some things than others. I doubt whether I have clearly fulfilled the plan that I set out in the introductory chapter, and for that reason I add these lines as a sort of summary in a concluding chapter. I do believe that the things on which I have insisted are more essential to an outline of history than the things which I have subordinated or dismissed. I do not believe that the past is most truly pictured as a thing in which humanity merely fades away into nature, or civilization merely fades away into barbarism, or religion fades away into mythology, or our own religion fades away into the religions of the world. In short, I do not believe that the best way to produce an outline of history is to rub out the lines. I believe that of the two, it would be far nearer the truth to tell the tale very simply, like a primitive myth about a man who made the sun and stars, or a god who entered the body of a sacred monkey. I will therefore sum up all that has gone before in what seems to me a realistic and reasonably proportioned statement: the short story of mankind. The short story of mankind. In the land lit by that neighboring star, whose blaze is the broad daylight, there are many and very various things motionless and moving. There moves among them a race that is in its relation to others a race of gods. The fact is not lessened but emphasized because it can behave like a race of demons. Its distinction is not an individual illusion like one bird pluming itself to its own plumes. It is a solid and a many-sided thing. It is demonstrated in the very speculations that have led to its being denied. That men, the gods of this lower world, are linked with it in various ways is true, but it is another aspect of the same truth that they grow as the grass grows and walk as the beasts walk is a secondary necessity that sharpens the primary distinction. It is like saying that a magician must after all have the appearance of a man. It is like saying that a magician must after all have the appearance of a man, or that even the fairies could not dance without feet. It has lately been the fashion to focus the mind entirely on these mild and subordinate resemblances and to forget the main fact altogether. It is customary to insist that man resembles the other creatures. Yes, and that very resemblance he alone can see. The fish does not trace the fish-bone pattern in the fowls of the air, or the elephant and the emu compare skeletons. Even in the sense in which man is at one with the universe, it is an utterly lonely universality. The very sense that he is united with all things is enough to sunder him from all. Looking around him by this unique light, as lonely as the little flame that he alone has kindled, this demigod or demon of the visible world makes that world visible. He sees around him a world of a certain style or type. It seems to proceed by certain rules or at least repetitions. He sees a green architecture that builds itself without visible hands, but which builds itself in a very exact plan or pattern, like a design already drawn in the air by an invisible finger. It is not, as is now vaguely suggested, a vague thing. It is not a growth or a groping of blind life. Each seeks an end, a glorious and radiant end, even for every daisy or dandelion we see in looking across the level of a common field. In the very shape of things, there is more than green growth. There is the finality of the flower. It is a world of crowns. This impression, whether or no it be an illusion, has this impression, whether or not it be an illusion, has so profoundly influenced this race of thinkers and masters of the material world that the vast majority have been moved to take a certain view of that world. They have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that the world had a plan, as the tree seemed to have a plan, and an end and crown like the flower. But so long as the race of thinkers was able to think, it was obvious that the admission of this idea of a plan brought with it another thought more thrilling and even terrible. There was someone else, some strange and unseen being, who had designed these things, if indeed they were designed. There was a stranger who was also a friend, a mysterious benefactor who had been before them and built up the woods and hills for their coming, and had kindled the sunrise against their rising, as a servant kindles a fire. Now, this idea of a mind that gives a meaning to the universe has received more and more confirmation within the minds of men by mediations and experiences much more subtle and searching than any such argument about the external plan of the world. But I am concerned here with keeping the story in its most simple and even concrete terms. And it is enough to say here that most men, including the wisest men, have come to the conclusion that the world has such a final purpose and therefore such a first cause. But most men, in some sense, separated themselves from the wisest men when it came to the treatment of that idea. There came into existence two ways of treating that idea, which between them made up most of the religious history of the world. The majority, like the minority, had this strong sense of a second meaning in things, of a strange master who knew the secret of the world. But the majority, the mob or mass of men, naturally tended to treat it rather in the spirit of gossip. The gossip, like all gossip, contained a great deal of truth and falsehood. The world began to tell itself tales about the unknown being, or his sons or servants or messengers. Some of the tales may truly be called old wives' tales, as professing only to be very remote memories of the morning of the world. Myths about the baby moon or the half-baked mountains. Some of them might more truly be called travelers' tales, as being curious but contemporary tales brought from certain borderlands of experience, such as miraculous cures, or those that bring whispers of what has happened to the dead. Many of them are probably true tales. Enough of them are probably true to keep a person of real common sense more or less conscious that there really is something rather marvelous behind the cosmic curtain. But in a sense, it is only going by appearances, even if the appearances are called apparitions. It is a matter of appearances and disappearances. At the most, these gods are ghosts, that is, they are glimpses. For most of us, they are rather gossip about glimpses, and for the rest, the whole world is full of rumors, most of which are almost avowedly romances. The great majority of the tales about gods and ghosts and the invisible king are told, if not for the sake of the tale, at least for the sake of the topic. They are evidence of the eternal interest of the theme. They are not evidence of anything else, and they are not meant to be. They are mythology or the poetry that is not found in books. They are mythology or the poetry that is not bound in books. They are mythology or the poetry that is not bound in books or bound in any other way. Meanwhile, the minority, the sages or thinkers, had withdrawn apart and had taken up an equally congenial trade. They were drawing up plans of the world which all believed to have a plan. They were trying to set forth the plan seriously and to scale. They were setting their minds directly to the mind that had made the mysterious world, considering what sort of a man it might be and what its ultimate purpose might be. Some of them made that mind much more impersonal than mankind has generally made it. Some simplified it almost to a blank. A very few, doubted it altogether. One or two of the more morbid fancied that it might be evil and an enemy. Just one or two of the more degraded in the other class worshipped demons instead of gods. But most of these theorists were theists, and they not only saw a moral plan in nature, but they generally laid down a moral plan for humanity. Most of them were good men who did good work, and they were remembered and reverenced in various ways. They were scribes. Any of their scriptures became more or less holy scriptures. They were lawgivers, and their tradition became not only legal but ceremonial. We may say that they received divine honors in the sense in which kings and great captains in certain countries often received divine honors. In a word, wherever the other popular spirit, the spirit of legend and gossip, could come into play, it surrounded them with the more mystical atmosphere of the myths. Popular poetry turned the sages into saints. But that was all it did. They remind themselves. Men never really forgot that they were men, only made into gods in the sense that they were made into heroes. Divine Plato, like Divus Caesar, was a title and not a dogma. In Asia, where the atmosphere was more mythological, the man was made to look more like a myth, but he remained a man. He remained a man of a certain social class or school of men, receiving and deserving great honor from mankind. It is the order or school of the philosophers, the men who have set themselves seriously to trace the order across any apparent chaos in the vision of life. Instead of living on imaginative rumors and remote traditions and the tail end of exceptional experiences about the mind and meaning behind the world, they have tried in a sense to project the primary purpose of that mind a priori. They have tried to put on paper a possible plan of the world, almost as if the world were not yet made. Right in the middle of all these things stands up an enormous exception. It is quite unlike anything else. It is a thing final, like the trump of doom, though it is also a piece of good news, or news that seems too good to be true. It is nothing less than the loud assertion that this mysterious maker of the world has visited his world in person. It declares that really and even recently, or right in the middle of historic times, there did walk into the world this original invisible being, about whom the thinkers make theories and the mythologists hand down myths. the man who made the world. That such a higher personality exists behind all things had indeed always been implied by all the best thinkers as well as by all the most beautiful legends. But nothing of this sort had ever been implied in any of them. It is simply false to say that the other sages or heroes had claimed to be that mysterious master and maker of whom the world had dreamed and disputed. Not one of them had ever claimed to be anything of the sort. Not one of their sects or schools had even claimed that they had claimed to be anything of the sort. The most that any religious prophet had said was that he was the true servant of such a being. The most that any visionary had ever said was that men might catch glimpses of the glory of that spiritual being or much more often of lesser spiritual beings. The most that any primitive myth had even suggested was that the Creator was present at the creation, but that the Creator was present at scenes a little subsequent to the supper parties of Horace and talked with tax collectors and government officials in the detailed daily life of the Roman Empire, and that this fact continued to be firmly asserted by the whole of that great civilization for more than 1,000 years. That is something utterly unlike anything else in nature. It is the one great startling statement that man has made since he spoke his first articulate word instead of barking like a dog. Its unique character can be used as an argument against it as well as for it. It would be easy to concentrate on it as a case of isolated insanity, but it makes nothing but dust and nonsense of comparative religion. It came on the world with a wind and rush of running messengers proclaiming that apocalyptic portent, and it is not unduly fanciful to say that they are running still. What puzzles the world and its wise philosophers and fanciful pagan poets about the priests and people of the Catholic Church is that they still behave as if they were messengers. A messenger does not dream about what his message might be or argue about what it probably would be. He delivers it as it is. It is not a theory or a fancy but a fact. It is not relevant to this intentionally rudimentary outline to prove in detail that it is a fact, but merely to point out that these messengers do deal with it as men deal with a fact. All that is condemned in Catholic tradition, authority and dogmatism, and the refusal to retract and modify are but the natural human attributes of a man with a message relating to a fact. I desire to avoid in this last summary all the controversial complexities that may once more cloud the simple lines of that strange story which I have already called, in words that are much too weak, the strangest story in the world. I desire merely to mark those main lines and specially to mark where the great line is really to be drawn. The religion of the world in its right proportions is not divided into fine shades of mysticism or more or less rational forms of mythology. It is divided by the line between the men who are bringing that message and the men who have not yet heard it or cannot yet believe it. But when we translate the terms of that strange tale back into the more concrete and complicated terminology of our time, we find it covered by names and memories of which the very familiarity is a falsification. For instance, when we say that a country contains so many Muslims, we really mean that it contains so many monotheists, and we really mean by that it contains so many men with the old average assumption of men that the invisible ruler remains invisible. They hold it along with the customs of a certain culture and under the simpler laws of a certain lawgiver. But so they would if their lawgiver were Lycurgus or Solon. They testify to something which is a necessary and noble truth, but was never a new truth. Their creed is not a new color, it is the neutral and normal tint that is the background of the many-colored life of man. Muhammad did not, like the Magi, find a new star. He saw through his own peculiar window a glimpse of the great grey field of the ancient starlight. So, when we say that the country contains so many Confucians or Buddhists, we mean it contains so many pagans whose prophets have given them another and rather vaguer version of the invisible power, making it not only invisible but almost impersonal. When we say that they also have temples and idols and priests and periodical festivals, we simply mean that this sort of heathen is enough of a human being to admit the popular element of pomp and pictures and feasts and fairy tales. We only mean that pagans have more sense than Puritans. But what the gods are supposed to be, what the priests are commissioned to say, is not a sensational secret like what those running messengers of the gospel had to say. Nobody else expect those messengers has any gospel. Nobody else has any good news for the simple reason that nobody else has any news. Those runners gather impotence as they run. Ages afterwards, they still speak as if something had just happened. They have not lost the speed and momentum of messengers. They have hardly lost, as it were, the wild eyes of witnesses. In the Catholic Church, which is the cohort of the message, there are still those headlong acts of holiness that speak of something rapid and recent, a self-sacrifice that startles the world like a suicide. But it is not a suicide, it is not pessimism, it is still as optimism. It is still as optimistic as Saint Francis of the Flowers and Birds. It is newer in spirit than the newest schools of thought, and it is almost certainly on the eve of new triumphs. For these men serve a mother who seems to grow more beautiful as new generations rise up and call her blessed. We might sometimes fancy that the church grows younger as the world grows old. For this is the last proof of the miracle that something so supernatural should have become so natural. I mean that anything so unique when seen from the outside should only seem universal when seen from the inside. I have not minimized the scale of the miracle as some of our wilder theologians think it wise to do. Rather have I deliberately dwelt on that incredible interruption as a blow that broke the very backbone of history. I have great sympathy with the monotheists, the Muslims or the Jews, to whom it seems a blasphemy that might shake the world, but it did not shake the world, it steadied the world. That fact, the more we consider it, will seem more solid and strange. I think it a piece of plain justice to all the unbelievers to insist upon the audacity of the act of faith that it demanded of them. I willingly and warmly agree that it is in itself a suggestion at which we might expect even the brain of the believer to reel when he realized his own belief. But the brain of the believer does not reel. It is the brains of the unbelievers that reel. We can see their brains reeling on every side and into every extravagance of ethics and psychology, into pessimism and the denial of life, into pragmatism and the denial of logic, seeking their omens in nightmares and their canons in contradictions, shrieking for fear at the far-off sight of things beyond good and evil, or whispering of strange stars where 2 and 2 make 5. Meanwhile, this solitary thing that seems at first so outrageous in outline remains solid and sane in substance. It remains the moderator of all these manias, rescuing reason from the pragmatists exactly as it rescued laughter from the Puritans. I repeat that I have deliberately emphasized its intrinsically defiant and dogmatic character. The mystery is how anything so startling should have remained defiant and dogmatic and yet become perfectly normal and natural. I have admitted freely that considering the incident in itself, a man who says he is God may be classed with a man who says he is glass. But the man who says he is glass is not a glazier making windows for all the world. He does not remain for after ages as a shining and crystalline figure in whose light everything is as clear as crystal. But this madness has remained sane. The madness has remained sane when everything else went mad. The madhouse has been a house to which age after age men are continually coming back as to a home. That is the riddle that remains, that anything so abrupt and abnormal should still be found a habitable and hospitable thing. I care not if the sceptic says it is a tall story. I cannot see how so toppling a tower could stand so long without foundation. Still less can I see how it would become as it has become the home of man. Had it merely appeared and disappeared, it might possibly have been remembered or explained as the last leap of the rage of illusion, the ultimate myth of the ultimate mood, in which the mind struck the sky and broke. But the mind did not break. It is the one mind that remains unbroken in the breakup of the world. If it were an error, it seems as if the error could hardly have lasted a day. If it were a mere ecstasy, it would seem that such an ecstasy could not endure for an hour. It has endured for nearly 2000 years. And the world within it has been more lucid, more level-headed, more reasonable in its hopes, more healthy in its instincts, more humorous and cheerful in the face of fate and death than all the world outside. For it was the soul of Christendom that came forth from the incredible Christ, and the soul of it was common sense. Though we dared not look on his face, we could look on his fruits, and by his fruits we should know him. The fruits are solid, and the fruitfulness is much more than a metaphor. And nowhere in this sad world are boys happier in apple trees. And nowhere in this sad world are boys happier in apple trees, or men in more equal chorus singing as they tread the vine than under the fixed flash of this instant and intolerant enlightenment, the lighting made eternal as the light. Appendix 1 on Prehistoric Man. On rereading these pages, I feel that I have tried in many places and with many words to say something that might be said in one word. In a sense, this study is meant to be superficial. That is, it is not meant as a study of the things that need to be studied. It is rather a reminder of the things that are seen so quickly that they are forgotten almost as quickly. Its moral, in a manner of speaking, is that first thoughts are best. So a flash might reveal a landscape with the Eiffel Tower or the Matterhorn standing up in it as they would never stand up again in the light of common day. I ended the book with an image of everlasting lightning in a very different sense. Alas, this little flash has lasted only too long. But the method has also certain practical disadvantages upon which I think it well to add these two notes. It may seem to simplify too much and to ignore out of ignorance. I feel this especially in the passage about the prehistoric pictures, which is not concerned with all that the learned may learn from prehistoric pictures, but with the single point of what anyone could learn from there being any prehistoric pictures at all. I am conscious that this attempt to express it in terms of innocence may exaggerate even my own ignorance. Without any pretense of scientific research or information, I should be sorry to have it thought that I knew no more than what was needed. In that passage of the states into which primitive humanity has been divided, I am aware, of course, that the story is elaborately stratified and that there were many such stages before the Cro-Magnon or any peoples with whom we associate such pictures. Indeed, recent studies about the Neanderthal and other races rather tend to repeat the moral that is here most relevant. The notion noted in these pages of something necessarily slow or late in the development of religion will gain little indeed from these later revelations about the precursors of the reindeer picture maker. The learned appear to hold that whether the reindeer picture could be religious or not, the people that lived before it were religious already, burying their dead with the significant signs of mystery and hopes. This obviously brings us back to the same argument, an argument that is not approached by any measurement of the earlier man's skull. It is little use here to compare the head of the man with the head of the monkey, if it certainly never came into the head of the monkey to bury another monkey with nuts in his grave to help him towards a heavenly monkey house. Talking of skulls, I am also aware of the story of the Cro-Magnon skull that was much larger and finer than a modern skull. It is a very funny story because an eminent evolutionist, awakening to a somewhat belated caution, protested against anything being inferred from one specimen. It is the duty of a solitary skull to prove that our fathers were our inferiors. Any solitary skull presuming to prove that they were superiors is felt to be suffering from swelled head. Appendix 2 on authority and accuracy. In this book, which is merely meant as a popular criticism of popular fallacies, often indeed of very vulgar errors, I feel that I have sometimes given an impression of scoffing at serious scientific work. It was, however, the very reverse of my intentions. I am not arguing with the scientist who explains the elephant, but only with the sophist who explains it away. And as a matter of fact, the sophist plays to the gallery, as he did in ancient Greece. He appeals to the ignorant, especially when he appeals to the learned. But I never meant my own criticism to be an impertinence to the truly learned. We all owe an infinite depth. We all owe an infinite depth to the researchers, especially the recent researchers. We all owe an infinite depth to the researchers, especially the recent researchers of single-minded students in these matters. And I have only professed to pick up things here and there from them. I have not loaded my abstract argument with quotations and references which only make a man look more learned than he is. But in some cases I find that my own loose fashion of allusion is rather misleading about my own meaning. The passage about Chaucer and the child martyr is badly expressed. I only mean that the English poet probably had in mind the English saint. of whose story he gives a sort of foreign version. In the same way, two statements in the chapter on mythology follow each other in such a way that it may seem to be suggested that the second story about monotheism refers to the southern seas. I may explain that Atohakan belongs not to Australasian but to American savages. So, in the chapter called The Antiquity of Civilization, which I feel to be the most unsatisfactory, I have given my own impression of the meaning of the development of Egyptian monarchy too much, perhaps, as if it were identical with the facts on which it was formed as given in works like those of Professor J.L. Myers. But the confusion was not intentional, still less was there any intention to imply in the remainder of the chapter that the anthropological speculations about races are less valuable than they undoubtedly are. My criticism is strictly relative. I may say that the pyramids are plainer than the tracks of the desert, without denying that wiser men than I may see tracks in what is to me the trackless sand. The book The Everlasting Man by K Chesterton ends here. Glory be to the Lord.